Okay, but prescription is the bigger picture. I'm really looking to say that in our work, we're working more and more on small things. We're working on, for example, getting our patients to take their tablets better. They're now fantastic. A friend of mine in Bray developed a multi-dose system, an MDS system, and you can now track what happens to the patients the whole way through, from giving them the tablets to make sure they took them. And I saw a pharmacy in Cavan had the same thing. We're getting really good at measuring things and doing things very precisely. We're working on counting more tablets faster and cheaper. And I'm afraid that sometimes we lose the bigger picture, that we're in healthcare and we're talking about community healthcare. And community is not an individual, it's a group. And I'd like to talk about a few things. I work as a pharmacist. I work 4 days a week as a pharmacist, and the rest of the week I have a company called Nutricentric Healthcare. Now, Nutricentric is not really a business, it's more an expensive mistress. It's what I do the rest of the time. I'm out, I have a business, I have products that I sell, but my real message is trying to get pharmacies to work on fixing things, not just doing things that other people prescribe, if you understand what I mean. Now, I'll come up with some of the science now. There are a few studies I'd like to refer to, and I hope if some of this is a little challenging, you may think at some stage I'm just a hippie and that none of this is relevant, but let's say if by avoiding sometimes drugs and getting people to work on food instead, if people live 10 years longer for that, you won't be losing business, you'll be gaining it. And what I talk about, I also practice. I work in Doc Morris Pharmacy in Conry and in a couple of independent pharmacies in Dublin, and I thank them for indulging my hippie ways. Last year I was tutor to an M-Pharm, a guy doing his pre-reg year, and I learned a lot from working that program with him. One of the things he had to do was a medication review, and I think the technician's course now includes that as well, to do a medication review with the patient to make sure they're taking the right tablets at the right time, and maybe to advise the doctor to prescribe something else. In Scotland, 2 or 3 years ago, they ran a study on this, on pharmacies supervising patients who had heart failure. And it was called the HOOPS study, and the results were presented in 2011 at the American Heart Association meeting. And they had tracked about 1,000 patients in 90 GP practices, and they got the pharmacists, about 30 pharmacists, to talk about their medication. And at the end of 4 years supervision, the HOOPS, the name of the study is Heart Failure Optimization of Outcomes Through Pharmacy Supervision. And the idea was they hoped that treatment would improve by having the pharmacies look after how people were taking the tablets. In fact, no lives were saved. It was a great study, and the study authors noted that the pharmacists had managed to get the people to take better drugs, more modern drugs than they were taking originally, and to take the right doses. But actually, nobody was saved. Now, the reason why this whole medication review thing is coming in is because the hope is, pharmacies are hoping that the HSE will pay for the pharmacy to do this sort of review. I think there are far bigger things we could be doing that have a bigger impact. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Framingham study. Okay, Framingham is a small town in Massachusetts, about 20 miles west of Boston. And in the 1940s, shortly after World War II, they started a study there where they were monitoring the population, 5,000 out of 50,000 people in the town. And they tracked them over 10, the study's still ongoing, they tracked them over time and then factored in all the factors that might be impacting on their health. That was a very new thing at the time. By the 1960s, they started getting data that showed that obesity is more likely to cause people heart attacks and heart failure, that having high sugar levels, high cholesterol, having too much salt, all those things that you know, and hypertension, that they all have a big impact on health. So a lot was learned from that. And in the 1970s, that information was first used in a big study. In Finland, in the 1970s, they had the highest rate of heart death in the world. They were the worst in the world. And if you asked the Finns about their diet, that would have been a traditional diet. They'd been quite happy with the way they were, because that's the way it is in communities. You keep doing the things you're doing and you think it's okay. You have to be challenged from outside. Their situation was so bad that the WHO got involved and got them to run a pilot project in northern Finland to see could changing lifestyle affect cholesterol and affect deaths. And they managed a huge outcome from that study. in fact, Finns now live 10 years longer than they did in the 1970s because of that. Cholesterol levels dropped dramatically. So the government worked in, because it's a bit like the Troika coming in. The WHO was watching what the government was doing, so they didn't just do pretend stuff. They really had to do it. They went, the government talked with food producers. They provided financing so that towns could compete, you know, which was it, lose it and win, as in lose weight, get smaller inches down the race, give up smoking, all those things that they figured would be good for health. They gave financial incentives, that there were prizes for different towns. And the impact was huge. Finns live 10 years longer now. And of course, cholesterol levels dropped dramatically from doing those healthy things. And, okay, is that a surprise? You know, lifestyle is big. But at that stage, we didn't have a Lipitor or a Crestor or any of those things. Cholesterol levels dropped dramatically. And the very funny thing is they've been reviewing this Finnish study ever since. And the big thing they found was that the bigger impact was by looking at the community, not at individual patients. So let's say if you go into a GP and you have some sort of health problem, but the doctor says, run a little bit more, eat a little bit less stuff, the patient is not going to be happy. But if you do that for a community, it makes a huge difference. And this is the difference. They treated Finland as a patient, as a community. So everybody was in on it. What they found was that it's not only the high-risk patients that benefit, it's also the relatively low risk. So people whose cholesterol was, let's say, 5.5 or 6, so just above normal, would maybe have let's say, for example, in this front row, the people have high cholesterol, 8 and above. They have a 25% risk of dying in any 1 year. And then all the rest of you have a moderate, from the second row back, have only a moderately raised risk factor, as in, you know, you may have slightly elevated blood sugar or cholesterol or whatever. And you have a 10% risk of dying. So at the end of a year, if we get you to reduce your risk, which group benefits more? It's the bigger group with the smaller risk. So all our focus in medicine is we look at the high-risk patients. But actually, we save far more lives by intervening earlier. Now, I can imagine you'd be thinking that this is all doctor stuff, this has nothing to do with us, but it's not the way. You know, when things get serious, the thing that motivates me is a person comes into you and they have a little bit of high blood pressure, a little bit of high cholesterol, or they're starting to have a problem with blood sugar, and then they're in shock. They get a prescription, they start taking the tablets. 2 years later, they have an extra problem. Now, suddenly they're getting, you know, maybe the blood sugar's got a little bit worse. They're starting to get swollen ankles from taking antihypertensives. You throw in a bit of furosemide to try and get rid of the swelling of the ankles. And, you know, furosemide used to be used by jockeys and boxers to help them make the weight. You pee like a horse. And, you know, it's not the most pleasant. Then people will go off that and they'll go on to a thiazide diuretic. And then they'll end up diabetic a few years later. So they slip. Step by step, they slip down the road. And all our work in giving them their tablets and telling them how to use them is not changing that. And that's really the point I'm trying to make is you are working with these people. If you get them early and get them to intervene and do something. Now, you're not going to talk about heart failure because heart failure is not something they can feel. You're not going to talk to them about hypertension because hypertension is called the silent killer because people can't feel it. But what they can feel is inflammation. Now, my focus is nutrition because inflammation is now the thing that combines pretty much all the modern diseases. They involve inflammation. If you have inflammation from one disease, let's say you have diabetes, you're more likely to have other conditions that cause inflammation. If you have inflammation from stress, you will have more easily problems with other health conditions. So all these things add up. So people might not be interested in talking to you about hypertension, but if they have varicose veins, which is nothing other than inflamed vessels, or hemorrhoids, which is just varicose veins in the bum, and are you know, inflamed nasal tubes, or they have high blood pressure because the vessels are getting swollen. These are all things that they can change with inflammation. They won't do anything just because it's changing a measurement in the doctor's office. They'll do it because they'll feel better. And this is what you want to do, is to try and motivate people to do things to feel better. Yeah, I'll go through now a couple of things that I've seen. I worked a long time overseas in industry, and I think that's the main reason I'm doing what I'm doing now. I went from 1980s Ireland, where people were thin and wore black, over to very wealthy Germany. Germany was in the boom time in the 1980s, and they were all 3-4 stone heavier, and they had a big problem with heart disease and diabetes, which didn't happen here. The people there didn't really realise that it was from food. Me coming from poor Ireland, I could see that where their health problems were coming from. And I moved from there out to Asia. I spent probably more of my life working in Asia than any other place. I was 5 years in China, 5 in Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and so on. And when I got to Korea, for example, they had only 1% of the incidence of heart attack of Europe. So it was practically unknown. In fact, one of the people in the company where I worked died because he wasn't recognized as a heart attack in the main teaching hospital in Seoul. They hadn't seen one before, the doctors on duty. There was no prostate cancer. These things they have now because they are, when I was playing soccer there, our sponsor was Denmark Dairy, so they've gone with our Western diet since, and they have the problems that we have. After Korea, I was in China, and I was working with the top gastroenterologist there, Professor Pan Guozong, on a study on IBS. And he pointed out to me that there were big regional differences in IBS and Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis because China has you probably know about Sichuan cuisine and there's Cantonese cuisine, but China has very clear regional cuisine, but they're all Chinese. Ethnically, they're all Chinese. And the areas where they have biggest problem with bowel disease are the areas that eat bread. Most Chinese eat rice. But the areas where they have the biggest problems with bowel conditions are the bread-eating areas. These would be areas they would consider Muslim areas because there would have been some Muslim tradition there in the past, but they eat things like lamb and pita breads. And they'd be a big part of the diet in those areas. Nothing to do with religion, it's a cultural thing. And during this study, we had centres in Shanghai, Xi'an, Beijing, and the other places. And the study was finished in about 2 months in Xi'an, which was one of those bread-eating areas, and took 2 years to complete in Shanghai, which is a rice-eating, fish-eating area. You can see these things black and white that we can't see in Europe anymore. So I worked a little bit in doing clinics in China as well, and worked with patients, and I was there as the foreigner, and if the professor was busy, I ended up working with the patients as well, and I really itched to get back into working on patients and people and maybe trying to change things and not just give them tablets. And I'm not against drugs at all. They're key because they can do things quickly and they can change symptoms. But you want to change risk factors, and you lose sight of the big picture if you only focus on the small picture. The reason I have these things here is because I want to talk a little bit about some of the foods and about food intolerance in general. One of the things I do in Nutricentric is I sell diagnostic products because I think measuring things makes it easier for people to stick to a regime. The enemy is inflammation. The way you can increasing inflammation can be by stress, by carrying extra weight, by having a disease, by eating too much sugar, or by having any other health condition. And things that reduce inflammation would be exercise is a good one. There was a talk in Trinity about 6 months ago. Professor Walter Bortz from Stanford University, he's in his 70s. He's the US leading researcher in age research, in longevity. He runs marathons now in his 70s all over the world. And he was giving a talk about exercise as a way to improve health. One of the people in the audience said, well, what about food? He said, if you're fit enough, you can eat lard. And of course, that's not true. And I had a little chat with him afterwards over a glass of wine. And he said he was only joking. But in fact, exercise is a very, very good way of reducing inflammation. But food is also, and you should do the lot. So basically, if you sleep well, because inadequate sleep increases inflammation. There is a very interesting study done a while ago where a US diabetes researcher got the images from space of where the lights are on at night in the USA and matched that to the diabetes incidence. And you find a match where people are up all night, there's more diabetes. You know the thing, when your day-night rhythm is knocked out, your cortisol levels go up, you crave sweet things, you crave sugar. So if you don't sleep enough, if you go to bed at 2 in the morning, as I tend to, you're going to crave sugar the next day because you're just knocked out, you're jet-lagged. There are many, many things that will contribute. Exercise is one thing you want to get right. You want to get your food right. You want to get sleep right. You want to think right, as in, thinking positive thoughts is healthier than thinking negative thoughts. One of the outcomes from the Framingham study is also that how people feel affects their health. There was a study of civil servants in the UK where they also found that people who thought their work environment was unfair tended to die earlier. Because these things weigh on you, and they weigh on you every day. And just the same way as food builds up because it's every day. I'll talk a little bit about food intolerance because that's one of the things that I learned in China. And I came back and I started doing tests. And I bought tests and I forced people to give me their blood because I just knew it was going to make a difference. And you don't believe me, that really is that way. I just wanted to see what would happen. And I got results that I would never have imagined. In my entire life as a pharmacist to date, I couldn't get the same results with drugs that I was able to get by just getting people to change their foods. Things like migraine, and I know there's a talk later on about migraine, but I've had people who would have had 2-week-long migraines and they, inside 2-3 weeks of changing the diet, they were gone as in completely. I have a colleague who had psoriasis for 20 years, used all the steroids, could never wear boots, had scars on her legs, had to burst blisters on her feet at night time to be able to put on shoes for work the next day. And that was gone in a month. Now she dabbles in the food, but she knows you can. That's the good thing about diet. If inflammation is bothering you, if you've got things like irritable bowel, or if you've got hormonal symptoms that drive the psychotic women thing, that part of this is hormonal, part of it is not. There's pretty much every health condition has at least one part that you control. Before we go on to a little deeper into food intolerance, I'll talk about genes, because genes are very, very interesting. You know the way in Europe now we talk about genetic cholesterol problems. My parents had it, so I will have it. And that it sounds very convincing. I've seen families where prostate cancer in the brother, prostate cancer in the father, and prostate cancer in the son, but they all eat the same stuff. They may be all alcoholics as well. They have the same risk factors. But it's a very easy way to just persuade yourself, there's nothing I can do about it. That's not true. It's really not true. And I can see that very clearly when I look at China. In China, they are now starting to get a cholesterol problem, and it's growing very, very quickly. But where it's growing quickest is in the cities where they're eating our Western diet. So if you look at Mr. Lee farming the lands where he puts cow dung on the vegetables and it's organic, and he's eating veg and a bit of rice and a bit of meat, and he's quite active, that Mr. Lee is not going to have a problem with cholesterol. But his cousin, Mr. Lee, who's been in the city and whose son is going to be in the city as well, is going to have a cholesterol problem. These things are fixable. And you may not believe it, but try it, it works. Now, going back to food intolerances, things like migraine, things like hormonal symptoms are all at least partly due to factors that you control. There's nothing that is 100%, or at least I cannot imagine, more than a tiny minority of things that are outside your control, that just the genetic button is there and there's nothing you can do. A couple of years ago in Iceland, there was a disease that they had found, genetic disease that was killing a lot of people in their 40s. And they were wondering why this was. And you might have seen this in the newspapers. They researched this and they found there was a gene responsible for it. And they went back into the graveyards and they dug up bones. They have a very good gene database in Iceland. And they found that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, nobody died young from this disease. The change was not the genes, but the food. So these are all things you don't realize them because they're happening, because you're eating every day. In Sweden, they've had an epidemic of celiac disease in the last 20 years. And it coincides with the introduction when they were trying to make the milk formulae more natural. So they started using cereals to put in some of the B vitamins into them. And when they added the cereals to the milk formulae, celiac disease increased dramatically. Now, celiac is another one of those funny things. We know in Ireland we have probably the highest incidence in the west of Ireland. We also have the highest incidence of schizophrenia in the west of Ireland. And recent studies have shown as well that gluten antibodies can be involved. High levels of gluten antibodies will be found also in schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, lots of other diseases as well. Now, I'm not trying to sell you food intolerance testing. These are things you can often work out yourself. If people, when people used to come into me to buy Motilium, before we had to talk about heart failure and not to take them for too long, I used to always ask them what were they eating last night. And in the pharmacies where I work, that's routinely what people do. They ask them, well, what have you been eating or doing over the last couple of days? People will say, no, I'm not doing anything different. Because people think doing something different is what causes them problems. It's not. It's doing the same things, the same wrong things for years and years is what causes you problems. At Christmas time causes a huge upsurge in prescriptions in January, gout, asthma, you name it, all happens in January. And that's due to people suspending their better judgment at Christmas time. So stuff they'd normally take once a month, because like banoffee pie or something, they're going to take every day because it's there. They're going to eat the stuffing that they know they feel bloated after. And then they're all wrecked in January. And then add to that the lack of sleep and the fights and the drink and all those other things. And then January, maybe you haven't noticed, but it's a really big time for that. And then comes around Lent a couple of months later, and people give up. They try to make up for the Christmas, and they give up the chocolate, and they crave that sugar. So they're looking for the methadone. So what do they go for? They remember the smoothie machine that's up in the attic, was given as a wedding present 3 years ago. It comes out, and they start shoving buckets of fruit in there. And the next day they've got gout, because the sugar's shooting into their bloodstream in their mouth already, even faster than in the chocolate. So we are addicts as well as everything else. So often the food that is causing the problem is something that the people take too much of. When you think about it, dairy 100 years ago in Ireland, there would have been milk, there would have been a bit of buttermilk, and there would have been a bit of cheese, but now we've far more dairy products. We eat yogurts, and yogurts I'm going to come to in a moment. Yogurts are a southern European thing, they weren't a northern European thing, and this is coming back to genes. The people that came to Ireland, not the people who just arrived in Ireland or have come in the last few years, but the people who came in thousands of years ago, they evolved coming up this far north in Europe. So what's the big difference between Northern Europe and Southern Europe? Climate, yeah, absolutely. We don't have sunshine, believe it or not. So where did we get our vitamin D? Vitamin D is vital. In the pharmacy where I work, we sell absolutely loads of vitamin D. And if you have darker skin, you need even more of it, because you're going to get nothing from the little bit of sun we get in May or June or whatever, unpredictably. But we came up further north. So in Africa, in Asia, pretty much everywhere in the world, people are lactose intolerant after about 2 years of age. They can tolerate, they can't drink milk after that. They'll get sick. They'll get terrible gastrointestinal symptoms. So in Southern Europe, to be able to take dairy products, they ferment them. So they have these yogurts, and we know about these live cultures and so on. But there was a gene that developed in Anatolia and moved with the people who came along Southern Europe, up along the west coast, up to Ireland and Scandinavia and the UK, that moved gradually north. And this gene it's now died out where it started off, but it became more and more concentrated as we went north to allow us to drink milk as adults. And why would that be? Any thoughts on why was milk so vital? We had meat, we had veg. The other things grow quite well here. Why was milk a key to survival this far north? Not the calcium. That's a very good point, but it's the one that I learned and you learned, we were all taught, but it wasn't the calcium, it was the vitamin D. It was the D. Calcium is in water, calcium is in vegetables, calcium is absolutely everywhere. The countries with the highest osteoporosis in the world, have a guess. Ireland's one of them, Scandinavia, North America, New Zealand. Basically the people with the highest milk consumption have the highest asthma and the highest osteoporosis. In China, hardly any milk consumption. Now, because they're lactose intolerant, obviously they can't drink milk. You see Paul O'Connell, rugby player, sculling back a pint of milk and a big milk moustache around him. You wouldn't get Lionel Messi of Barcelona doing that. It'd come straight back up. Because this gene, 97% of Irish people are lactose tolerant. 97% of non-European people are lactose intolerant. Lactose intolerant is the norm. I read on a dietitian's website a while back, they were talking about lactose intolerance like a disease, that other people get. Lactose intolerance is not a disease, it's the norm. Milk is a baby food. It wasn't really meant to be consumed. There are hormones, there are lots of other things. You also get your mother's antibodies in breast milk and in milk, cow's milk. So that's a good thing as a baby, you get your mother's immune system. But if she has intolerances, their antibodies as well, they get passed on. So milk is a baby food in the rest of the world. This far north, we evolved to survive with milk. Now, what has happened to milk since thousands of years ago when most of us our ancestors got here? Yeah. Absolutely. Pasteurization, I looked into, before we had Vogel, because I worked in Germany and Austria as well, and doctors there have a very different view on herbs. They have a much more holistic view. And you'll know, if you've got Polish GPs around, they always prescribe probiotics when they write penicillin. And here we don't. But I looked at what did we use before we had Vogel herbs here. We used herbs as well, but they were nearly always, whether it was north, south, Munster, Leinster, Connacht, whatever, the basis for medicine was always milk. And when you think about it, milk was very healthy. There used to be probiotic bacteria in it. That was the big thing. This was our source of probiotics. We didn't have yogurts. We didn't do them. And we didn't need them because we got our probiotics in milk. And we also got vitamin D. We also got antibodies against diseases which were which they sometimes had cross-reactivity with our infections. So it was like a real immune booster, much more than we would get from probiotic yogurts nowadays. And this was the tradition. Pasteurization changed that. It destroyed a lot of the vitamin D. It killed off the probiotic bacteria and destroyed a lot of those antibodies as well. Now, it's still a good source of protein, but it's not what it was. So milk now, if you're drinking it for calcium, I'm afraid that's not a good enough reason anymore. Milk is a good food, not knocking it, but if somebody's drinking it to force themselves to drink it because they're worried about their bones, that's not a good reason. I talked about the Framingham study and about Finland, but there was also a women's health study, also run from Boston, where they track mostly nurses initially, 80,000 over 20 years at this stage. And they did one of the checks that they did was milk consumption and bone fractures. And they said, 0 to 1 glasses of milk a week, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, 5 and over. And the highest fracture rate was in the highest milk consumption group. Now, it's not saying that the milk caused the fractures, certainly not. But what it certainly shows is that the milk itself did not prevent the fractures. The vitamin D, now they're making super milk, they're putting vitamin D into it. So that's a good thing. But, if you have to look at food not only from the point of view of things that we learned in the past. You can never see things properly in a community. That's where in Finland it made such a big difference having the WHO come in and make them change it. We all think that our diet is great, our traditional diet, and we know we're eating some junk here as well, but we somehow believe that the traditional diet would be good. The traditional diet doesn't exist anymore. The wheat that used to be in Ireland, wheat is only quite new, but the grains have all changed in the last 20, 30 years. Our foods have changed dramatically. Now, you can make a huge difference on how people treat themselves, not only by selling them a tablet. People are going to come back to you and, when stuff doesn't work, and you want it to work, you want to change their lives, and you can. And believe me, I've shown in all the pharmacies that I work, by getting somebody to maybe not just take a painkiller, or not just take something for irritable bowel or whatever that is, but to change their diet, it actually improves the business in the pharmacy. We sell, I think in Doc Morris group, the pharmacy where I work in Conry, we're the top selling one for probiotics. We'd be there or thereabouts for omega-3, we'd be there or thereabouts for vitamin D and so on. These are all things that people use and need. And they're not going to be cut or genericized or, they're not things you have to worry about. They can contribute to the business, but they're also you working with your community. The patient, the community is the patient, not just the individual. Now, I've said a little bit about food intolerance, not too much, but I want to go on to sugar now. Sugar is the number one drug in the country. When I was growing up, a cup of tea was smaller, and you had maybe 2 of them during the day. There was always a kettle on the boil, particularly in the countryside, and the tea was undrinkable, it was tar. But people would have a couple of cups a day. They didn't drink much. Now people drink big mugs all the time because they're eating junk and they're thirsty. If you take more sugar, you need more stuff to quench it. And of course, when they drink the cup of tea, more sugar goes in. So there's about 4 or 5 times more sugar in that. And the children going out to school, they might get a nice probiotic yogurt in their bag. And they get a treat because if you're going out to school and you take something healthy, you should get a treat. So they'll get a bar of chocolate or chocolate biscuit with it as well. And they might have had a smoothie. The innocent smoothie, I like the name, innocent smoothie before leaving the house. And the poor child has no hope. Really, it's as if you're injecting heroin. Now, this may sound like a joke, but sugar is more addictive than cocaine. In the newspapers a couple of years ago, there was a very nice study done with rats. They were cocaine-addicted rats. And they gave them, so these were ones that they used for drugs, for testing the effects of drugs, cocaine-addicted rats. And they gave them sugar. And after a week, they gave them the choice. Do you want the sugar or do you want the cocaine? Sugar. And then other people said, oh, they weren't normal rats, they were cocaine-addicted rats. Let's try this with normal rodents. So another group did a nice study with normal mice. And they have these little mouse pellets that they give them in the lab to feed them. And they gave them, the little sugar syrup, and they gave the normal food. And then, they gave them the choice, and sugar. And then another group said, okay, obviously sugar is nicer than that junk that we're feeding the poor animals in the lab. So let's do a proper test. We'll give them the choice between the mouse food and sugar, but they have to go over a grill to get to the sugar, and they get electric shock all the way. Cruel, but what was the outcome? Yeah, sugar was the outcome. So when we're talking about sugar, and you know, I have a problem with sugar. I grew up with this. Sugar was, as a teenager, my little bit of pocket money, cigarettes or sugar, sugar won, that's my drug. And I fight that all the time. I play soccer still, and to be able to play, I have to be pretty good for at least 24 hours beforehand, or else I'm just a grand piano in the middle of the pitch, no fun. Being good takes 10 years off me, being bad, it puts 10 years on me. Now, looking at sugar, if ever you have the chance to go onto YouTube, there's a Robert Lustig, he's a pediatrician in California, he's done a very nice presentation on sugar. Lustig is his name, Sugar, the Bitter Truth. And he is looking at, you know, the smoking gun, how in the 1960s Coca-Cola put more salt into the Coca-Cola as well as more sugar, so that you'd want to use the bigger bottles. Now, what are the effects of sugar? I mean, we all know the obvious ones, but it's one of the biggest contributors to inflammation. It swells blood vessels, which is going to cause elevated blood pressure. So sugar is probably making more of a contribution to blood pressure nowadays than salt, because we've all copped on about salt. In fact, salt reduction has been so strong that in Switzerland they're now getting iodine deficiency. Iodine, their main source of iodine used to be salt, iodized table salt. And since they've all cut down the salt, they weren't getting enough iodine anymore, so they've had to recently put in more iodine into the table salt in Switzerland. But sugar, for example, fertility is another area I work a lot with nutritionists. You know, I refer people to nutritionists because it's not always easy to change food, but they do a lot of work on fertility, people who can't have children, and often these are the same causes as high blood pressure, migraines, all those things. It's food, mostly, and there are things you can do about sleep and exercise to help improve it. But infertility, for example, they did a study in 2 groups in the States. One where the mother-to-be was drinking a litre bottle of Coca-Cola a day, and compare that to a group where that wasn't the case. And it took the group that was taking the Coca-Cola. Okay, when I say Coca-Cola, it's a little unfair. It said carbonated, caffeinated drinks, 1 litre bottle. They didn't specify brand. That's my addition to it. I know that's what it was, but you know. And it took twice as long for them to get pregnant as the group that wasn't doing that. And in the Danish army, God knows how they did this, but they did sperm counts as well with large numbers of recruits in the Danish army, and compared their sugar consumption. And those who had the highest sugar consumption had sperm that couldn't swim, and they had less sperm. So if you're looking at, you know, about 50% of infertility has at least some male involvement. So if you put together, you know, a Coca-Cola habit in the mother and God knows what in the father as well, you can make things, like both things have to work correctly together to have a pregnancy. Now, this is just one simple example, and that's in relatively young people. You add on an extra year or two, an extra 10 years, and there's far more that you have to work with. But the time to do it, you know, the 1980s, there was a theory of crime prevention in the US called the broken window theory. Have you ever heard that? Yeah? Okay, the broken window theory of crime is that if there's a building that is not occupied for a while, some guys in hoodies will, eventually the brave ones will start throwing stones at them, will break a window. If you don't repair that window, then the guys who aren't quite as brave as that will start breaking windows as well, and soon it'll be broken. And then after a while, people are going to move in there to have parties, and eventually somebody's going to have a fire. So in other words, the very first thing, the first broken window, if you don't fix that, it leads to a spiral of further problems, to complete destruction. And it's exactly the same with health. You want to get people at the stage of when they have inflammation. So whether it's migraines, whether it's varicose veins, hemorrhoids, irritable bowel, the things that they come into you for, skin things that flare up in January after Christmas, that's the time you want to work with them. And it's no good just giving them a tablet to sort out the symptom today, because in a month's time they will know that what you didn't fix them. The same way as looking at the Finnish experience, dramatic, 10 years longer they live, 10 years longer from changing those risk factors. And it's not, you know, that you can change everything in one day. I know I fight with sugar. I've 50 methadone patients in one of the pharmacies where I work. And there's one of them, she comes every 2 or 3 days for a methadone, but she takes a large bag of sugar every 2 days. And she says, you know, methadone, she can go without the gear for a couple of days, but she can't do without her sugar. And when you think, these are things that if people know about them, when did your pain flare up? If it flared up after you had a chocolate cake last night or a bar of chocolate, and you will find this is the way people at night get these restless legs at night. Very often they'll be the people who will be taking a little slice of cake or a biscuit before going to bed, because it does inflame the vessels, and they're going to feel it there. I had a colleague in how am I doing with time actually? I know I've got to get out of here soon. Am I over or am I under? I'm okay. I won't go too much longer. Just you have to shoot me actually to get me. It's working on the little things first, and you can change them. Like just even asking when somebody comes in, have you been eating more of something in the last while? It might be they're taking more cheese. People who have a dairy problem. And the big problem is when somebody works that out for themselves, they go to the GP and they say, "Doctor, I notice that my asthma flares up when I take a lot of milk." What they will usually hear is, no, it's got nothing to do with that. And they will usually hear exactly the same thing for every other condition. They go in and say, "Doctor, do you think it could be I've got a real cheese habit? It could be," and mostly they will hear no. And the reason is that, this Framingham study, most of you hadn't heard of that before, and I didn't learn about it at college, I learned about it afterwards. They don't teach anything about that, and there's much bigger impact of changing those things than for anything we dispense. Now, not to say dispensing is wrong, we live from it, it's what brings the people into us, but we're talking, community pharmacy. The patient is the community is the patient. You've got to try and work on helping people improve themselves. And really, they will love you for it. If somebody's migraines go away, okay, they might miss whatever food is they've had to cut out, but they will appreciate it forever. They will come back to you. They will always buy things from you. It does add to your business. Please believe me on this. Okay, another little example, and I could go on with these all day. The acid reduction tablets, the PPIs, pantoprazole and so on. Great products. But, okay, the acid in your stomach is there for a purpose. What does the acid do in the stomach? Yeah, it breaks down, it hydrolyzes proteins. So if you don't break down those proteins, then you have this undigested protein in your gut. So then what do you do with that? A certain amount, you have 22 feet of gut then, it's going to gradually break down. But not all. You are much more likely to have food reactions if you're taking those long term than if you weren't taking them. And there's been a study done in the States with one of the PPIs in a purple box that people using that for more than 5 years had more food reactions. And it makes sense when you think about it. The other thing that happens is your gut bacteria change. Acidophilus, acidophile bacteria. No acid, no acidophilus. You lose your gut flora, and that has an impact on your mucus, because there's a balance between the more bacteria, the thicker the mucus that your body produces to sort of keep the bacteria out rather than in. So get rid of the bacteria, the mucus shrinks. So actually, the people become more sensitive over time. And then they go from having one PPI, 20 milligram, to a 40 milligram, then to 2, and then to maybe a Zantac as well, and as well as buckets of Gaviscon. Really, what was causing their problem in the first place? It's not necessarily what they think. People think acid foods or spicy foods are what's causing it. The problem is that if you've got a raw stomach, you can feel the spicy foods. It's not that they're the cause of the problem. It might be dairy. Now, in food intolerance testing, and I don't know if any of you got experience with food intolerance testing. Okay. I mean, the thing is that, dairy is the number one thing that shows up. Dairy is a good food, but if you react to it, it's not. And it's frequently people who take not just dairy, but take loads of dairy. And, this whole thing with intolerances, it wouldn't have been a problem 100 years ago because you couldn't get the same foods all year long. Now you can. And we get them much more concentrated, and you have different forms. And if you look at, even yeast is is the second most common thing that shows up. Yeast is not just beer and wine. Yeast is also flavorings. Pretty much all the flavorings used in food nowadays are produced by yeasts. So if you've got a problem with yeast, you buy a supermarket meal for €2, you can be sure there's not a whole lot of good food in there, but there's some lovely flavoring. If you buy smoky bacon crisps, big surprise, no smoke, no bacon. So if you react to yeast, you have a problem with those things. And of course, there's the carb from it. And the foods are made to make you addicted. The yogurts are made to make you addicted. Now, speaking about Robert Lustig, sorry, the Coca-Cola. Okay, does anyone know offhand how much sugar, what percent of that by weight would be sugar? Actually, it's not as bad as that. It's only 10%, 10.6% of Coca-Cola. So per 100 mils, 10.6 grams of sugar. Now we have, this is what's going out in the poor child's start to think. So, more or less. Yeah, it is more. It is more, but most people don't know that. And you buy these things because you see the ad, and the ad says, I say unit class and all sort of things. And there's a little bit of something good in there, but there's an awful lot of something bad. And the poor child gets a treat to go along with that. So there's how much is that? There's 14%, 30% more than, 40% more than in Coca-Cola. Would you know that? Otherwise, you wouldn't. I mean, it's there in the label. You can see it. See, Rachel. What she got? Organic, fat-free. I mean, that's got to be better than Coca-Cola, right? You may have noticed Rachel's canonical now. Now, and that's 30% more than Coca-Cola. And I mean, it's the problem is we go in as consumers, we don't know this stuff, and we're not taught to do it. When I train pharmacists on food intolerance testing, we usually go into supermarkets. That's the starting point, to read labels. And I hope that, if nothing else, after today, you will read stuff. Because if you buy even, like I crave chocolate, and I'm trying to find ways to avoid it. And if I get the different brands of wine gums are my methadone when I'm trying to come off chocolate. And there are different brands. You have one with 40% sugar, one with 20% sugar. So at least I can choose, now that I know to look, to go for the one that's a little less bad, if it was. Now, there are a lot of products that are, try to make themselves look very healthy. Now, it's great that there are many gluten-free products. I just mentioned, though, that a lot of celiacs have problems not only with gluten, they have problems with other foods as well. I mean, in Sweden, the best predictor of being celiac at age 5 was having a reaction to dairy and to gluten. So often it's not just gluten. And it makes sense, same sort of, if you react to one, you can react to more. Gluten is the biggest part of the problem. But a lot of gluten-free stuff, to hide the fact that they don't taste right, you put in extra sugar. Have you ever tasted any of the gluten-free? So they're vile. And they hide that with sugar. So in other words, if you were trying to be nice to someone, what are we going to give that person a birthday, birthday treat? It's actually terrible food. If you need to get off taking something that you know is bad and just one off and continue. Now, any other examples? Yeah, I love this stuff. Weight Watchers. What percentage of that is sugar? Too much. 46%. So now, I mean, I don't need to go on, but basically, what is okay is a normal yogurt. Normal yogurt would be about 5% sugar. That's sort of natural level of sugar. Stuff that's around the 10%. That's very funny. All these sort of liquidy things tend to end up with around 10%. So it nearly seems as if the companies somehow just stumble upon that amount of sugar that will get you hooked and keep you hooked. And the poor children, if you get them hooked on sugar at that age, they're going to be diabetic. The one thing that has been found, studies in Austria found that kids that are obese and have food intolerances will also, they already have their arteries are hardening at the age of 12 and 13. Because one problem makes the other problem happen more easily. It's this broken windows theory of crime. The broken windows theory of health is, I think, the way to go. It's inflammation is what fuels it. Okay, I'll let you go now because I know it's time to go. Now, so the only thing I'd like to say is, the community of the patient, work on the broken windows. Don't wait till the building falls down. Okay, thank you very much.
Ask 2 questions. If anybody has 2 quick questions for Peter just before we let him run away. I think that was very informative. James, want to ask?
What about the products like Actimel, the case and immune chest and stuff? They be bad eggs as well, like your...
Yeah, more than Coca-Cola. I think it's like 10% more.
It's like I have osteopenia, so my doctor said, matchbox cheese, my calcium, so I used to take 2 Actimel just to get the shot of calcium. This is the easiest way to get it into your take.
And weight-bearing exercise.
Yeah.
Now, incidentally, weight-bearing exercise is the thing. So going up the hill is better than walking the level.
Yeah.
They did a study on bone strength in gymnasts and marathon runners. Gymnasts, yeah, they have the extra gravity, so they get much stronger bones. So doing stuff is tricky. So D, and I'm not saying that when you're a bit of dairy, if you're taking to force yourself to do it, I say you're better off with it. If you're taking that dairy to force yourself to take it for the calcium, probably better off. And I've had loads of people. That's the people, my patients and customers are great lunatics. The whole crack team, and they try stuff out for me. Go to the gym, give up the air smell, and just do the exercise, take your knee, and it works.
Yeah, so like get the holiday
So what you react to, your brothers and sisters do, one of them will feel it, and others won't feel it.
Oh, my sister has it as well.
Okay.
My brother got tested.
Any other questions?
Just you were saying about in pregnancy with the mother and they take the liter of Coke. What effect does that have on an unborn baby or a newborn baby if the sugar level is that high or she has an addiction to sugar?
I'm not sure. I know that the whole way through pregnancy there is an impact. In other words, things are more likely to happen. The birth is more likely to be difficult. So there's an impact all the way through. The babies, I suppose, like the crack babies, you know.
That's what I mean, is like control or...
I don't know. Maybe there is that. Nobody's studied that yet, but I think you're probably right. And I'd say if you even observe, like, you know, clinical trials don't need 10,000 people. When you look at 2, 3 of your patients or friends or whatever, you can learn stuff from just looking at it. You probably know cases like that.
Continue breastfeeding with the sugar intake that she would have through her
You
does that pass through her breast milk? So the sugar for the baby is continuous from birth.
Yes, and you want that reduced. But kids, the good thing about kids is if you just give them stuff, that's it. You know, they may crave and they shout and scream, but after 3 days, you know, I know how hard it is to give up sugar for 3 days. Now, I know it sounds easy, but as I said, my methadone customer, she's really like a lot of my methadone customers are really good chemists. They know their chemistry, and I mean she knows that the craving from missing the bag of sugar is much stronger than from methadone. But kids do what you tell them, basically, you know. But that's the problem, because we like to do stuff we like, and I did it myself. And Actimel got my son hooked on sugar. We came from China. He'd grown up taking bits of sweet things. I mean, now he'd been born there. My 2 kids were born in Asia, and they hadn't really got sugar habit. Actimel made my